3 things happened, 16 centuries apart, and they look like they have nothing to do with each other. In the year 408, the Emperor Honorius ordered the provincial governors of the Western Roman Empire to act as estate agents for one private family. Why would an emperor do that? In 1983, the legislature of South Dakota quietly deleted a rule of English common law that had stood since the 17th century. What does that have to do with a British journalist who could not sleep in Shanghai in 1948 and who got out of bed and looked out of the window and saw something he did not understand for another year? And in 2017, 5 men paid a media theorist roughly half his annual salary to fly to a remote resort and answer a single question. How do you keep armed guards obedient after money stops working? Those are not 3 stories. They are 1, still running, and by the time you can see the thread, none of the 3 will be the part that bothers you. Settle in, because the last 20 minutes reframe everything before them. The people doing this are not predicting anything, and that is the part that should worry you. Ad-free versions of these go up early over on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of, along with an audio-only feed for listening with the screen off. Subscribe or join if you have not. Let's start where it started. On the night of the 1st of December, 1948, a British journalist named George Vine could not sleep. He was staying at the Cathay Hotel on the Shanghai Bund, the Art Deco pile that everyone now calls the Peace Hotel, and at some point in the small hours he got out of bed and looked down at the waterfront. What he saw was a line of men, porters, moving in single file out of the side entrance of the Bank of China, each one carrying a wooden crate on a shoulder pole, walking down to the water where a customs vessel called the Heisching was tied up with no lights showing. He watched them for a long time. He had no idea what he was looking at. He worked it out later, and what he had been looking at was roughly 90 tons of gold. The monetary reserve of the Republic of China being carried out of the country by hand in the dark. Here is the part that matters. At that moment, the nationalist government of China was still telling its own population that the war was going well. It was still selling war bonds. It was still ordering conscription. It would continue to make public statements about holding the line for another 11 months. Chiang Kai-shek would not formally relocate to Taiwan until December of 1949. The public position and the private position stayed separated for a full year, and in that year millions of people made decisions about their homes and their businesses and their children based on the public position. The private position was on a boat. I want to be precise about how we know this, because this is not a rumour that survived in someone's memoir. The American Consul General in Shanghai, a man named John Cabot, was reporting the shipments to Washington in real time. Those telegrams are declassified and published in the Foreign Relations of the United States series, Volume 9 of the 1949 collection. Cabot describes 3 separate consignments. He gives the tonnages. He notes, in the flat administrative way that diplomats note things, that the total value was at least $200 million and that none of it was insured. In February of 1949, he reports a further movement of roughly 160 tons of gold and silver. Historians still argue about the final total. Wu Xing-yung, whose father administered the operation, puts it at around 4 million taels, which comes out near 167 tons. Other reconstructions land between 112 and 187. The disagreement is about the arithmetic, not about the event. The event has almost nothing to do with gold. What it is about is a gap. There is a gap between what a governing class says about the future and where it actually puts its money, and that gap is the single most informative thing you can measure about any society. It is more informative than the news, it is more informative than the polling, it is more informative than anything a government will ever tell you about itself, because a government is an institution that is professionally obliged to project confidence, and a rich family is an institution under no such obligation whatsoever. The gap is normally very small. That is what a functioning society is. A functioning society is one where the people at the top have their wealth, their children, their status and their exit options all located inside the same jurisdiction as everybody else, which means their incentives and your incentives are approximately aligned, which means when the roof leaks, they have a reason to pay for the roof. Right now, in the United States of America, that gap is opening at a rate that has no precedent in the entire history of the measurement. I want to give you the number that made me start reading about this in the first place, because when I found it, I assumed I had misread it. Henley & Partners is the largest firm in the world that arranges what the industry calls investment migration. Second passports, golden visas, residency purchased with capital. For the entire modern history of that industry, the client base has been what you would expect. Russians, Chinese, Nigerians, Turks, citizens of countries with unstable currencies, capricious courts, and a real chance of a bad night. That is who buys a second passport, because that is who needs one. In 2025, according to the firm's own United States Wealth Report, American citizens accounted for more than 30% of all investment migration applications the company processed. Not 30% of applications from wealthy countries, 30% of the entire global book. More than the next 5 nationalities combined, and the next 5 were Turkish, Indian, Chinese, British and Filipino. 5 years earlier, that figure was so small, it was a rounding error. The firm's own investment migration programs report describes the increase from 2019 as being over 1,000%. Enquiries from Americans rose 183% between the first quarter of 2024 and the first quarter of 2025 alone. By the end of the third quarter of 2025, American applications were already 67% above the total for the whole of the previous year, and the previous year had itself been up 60%. Citizens of the wealthiest, most militarily dominant, most institutionally entrenched state in human history have become the single largest customer base for the business of not having to be a citizen of it. And it is not just the expensive route. You can watch the same behaviour in the cheap, bureaucratic, deeply unsexy corners of the system where nobody is selling anything. Ireland maintains something called the Foreign Births Register, which is how you claim Irish citizenship through a grandparent. It is free apart from a small fee, it is slow, and it is essentially a filing exercise. American applications to that register went from 11,600 and one in 2024 to 18,910 in 2025. That is a 63% increase, and it is the highest figure since the process went digital in 2013. More than 6,100 American citizens applied for British citizenship in 2024, a record, up 26%. These are not people buying a lifestyle. Nobody moves to the Irish administrative system for the weather. These are people acquiring an option. Now, there is an obvious objection here, and I am going to make it myself, right now, before you make it, because I want you to know I am not going to spend 2.5 hours hiding from the counter-argument. The obvious objection is that Henley & Partners sells the exact anxiety it measures. They publish the report, and they take the commission. A firm that profits from wealthy people feeling nervous is not a neutral instrument for measuring how nervous wealthy people are. That objection is correct, and we are going to come back to it with teeth later, and there is an independent advisor named Sebastian Sauerborn who has gone through the migration figures line by line and called several of them implausible. And I think he lands some real hits. But the Irish Foreign Births Register does not have a sales team. And here is the thing that I cannot get around, and it is the reason this became an obsession rather than a curiosity. One elevated indicator would be nothing at all. What I cannot get around is that every single independent indicator of elite hedging is elevated simultaneously in different jurisdictions measured by different institutions, using different methodologies, with different commercial interests, and several of them are at all-time record highs in the same 18-month window. Central bank gold buying, millionaire relocation, trust assets in secrecy jurisdictions, family office formation in Singapore, farmland concentration, second citizenship acquisition. Every needle on the dashboard is in the red at once, and the dashboard was assembled by people who were not talking to each other. That is the actual finding, not any single number. The correlation, and I want to plant something here at the beginning that is going to sit underneath everything else in this video, because I am not going to be able to make it land properly until you have seen the whole picture, and if I say it now you will think it is a smaller idea than it is. Everyone who has ever looked at this pattern has looked at it as a forecast. They treat elite hedging as a prediction, and then they argue about whether the prediction is accurate. Do rich people know something? Are they seeing a crash the rest of us cannot see? That is the frame in every article ever written about billionaire bunkers, and it is the frame the industry itself encourages, because it flatters the client. That frame is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that inverts the whole thing. The hedge is not a forecast. Hold on to that sentence. We are going to spend the next 2 hours earning it. Because the historical record does something very strange when you look at it closely. It does not show a governing class successfully predicting a collapse and getting out ahead of it, like clever investors reading a chart. It shows something considerably worse than that, and considerably harder to think about, and I will tell you honestly that I have gone back and forth on it for weeks, and I am still not entirely comfortable with where it lands. Let me show you the rest of the dashboard first. Start with the movement of people, because it is the easiest thing to count. Henley's Private Wealth Migration Report tracks the physical relocation of individuals holding more than $1 million United States dollars in investable assets. In 2023, the figure was 120,000. In 2024, it was 134,000. In 2025, it hit 142,000. And the 2026 report, published on the 16th of June this year, projects 165,000. The firm describes it in flat terms as the largest migration of wealth on record. Look at where they are leaving from, and it stops being a story about the developing world. The single largest net outflow projected for 2025 did not come from Russia. And it did not come from China. It came from the United Kingdom at minus 16,500. That is the first time in the history of these reports that a Western European country has topped the list, and it is the largest net outflow the United Kingdom has ever recorded. China came second at minus 7,800, and that figure is notable because it is China's lowest in years, which tells you the outflow from Beijing has not accelerated. The outflow from London has. France lost 800, Germany lost 400, Norway lost 150, Sweden lost 50. Small numbers, and in a sense that is the point, because these are the numbers of a normal year in a normal country, and they are there for contrast. The receiving end is where it gets clarifying. The United Arab Emirates took in approximately 9,800 millionaires in 2025, which the 2026 report values at around $63 billion of associated wealth. The United States took 7,500, Switzerland 3,000, Italy 3,600 on the back of a flat tax regime, Saudi Arabia 2,400, Portugal 1,400, Greece 1,200. Notice what the destination list has in common, because it took me a while to see it, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. These are not the world's best democracies. Several of the largest recipients of the world's fleeing capital are absolute monarchies. What the destinations actually share is a credible commitment not to expropriate. combined with a tax authority that will not ask difficult questions, combined with physical distance from whatever is coming. Which raises a question that we are going to have to sit with for a while. If the people with the best information and the most resources are systematically moving their assets toward jurisdictions that offer protection from the state rather than participation in it, what exactly do they think the state is about to become? There is a second data set sitting next to the migration figures, and it is arguably more revealing, because it measures not where the wealthy are going, but what they are willing to pay for the right to go. The industry term is citizenship by investment. In plain language, it is a country selling its own nationality. The mechanics are straightforward. You make a qualifying contribution to a state fund, you pass a due diligence check of variable seriousness, and a few months later a sovereign state issues you a passport. St. Kitts and Nevis will do it for 250,000 United States dollars through what they call the Sustainable Island State Contribution. Dominica asks 200,000. Antigua and Barbuda raised its price from 100,000 to 230,000 on the 1st of August, 2024. Grenada asks 235,000, and Grenada is worth pausing on, because Grenada has held a treaty of commerce with the United States since 1989, which makes its nationals eligible for the American E2 investor visa. If you are Chinese or Indian, your own passport does not get you that treaty. A Grenadian one does. $235,000 converts a Chinese national into someone with a lawful business residency pathway into the United States. I want you to understand what that product actually is, because the marketing language obscures it completely. The brochures talk about global mobility and visa-free travel and optionality for the family. What is being sold is a legal identity that is not subject to the government you were born under. Everything else is packaging. The residency programs work the same way at a higher price point. The United Arab Emirates will grant a 10-year golden visa against a property purchase of 2 million dirhams, roughly $545,000. Singapore's Global Investor Program, restructured in March of 2023, asks for 10 million Singapore dollars deployed into a business, or the establishment of a family office holding at least 200 million Singapore dollars, with 50 million of that put to work locally. The American EB-5 program, since the Reform and Integrity Act of March 2022, sits at $800,000 in a targeted employment area, or $1,050,000 for a standard investment, with the first inflation adjustment due on the 1st of January 2027. Now hold those numbers in your head while I tell you what has been happening to the supply side, because this is the part of the story that almost nobody reports, and it is the part that changes the shape of everything. The exit is closing. On the 29th of April 2025, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Justice ruled in case C181/23. The European Commission against the Republic of Malta, that Malta's citizenship by investment scheme, was illegal under European Union law. The court's reasoning was not technical. It held that the acquisition of Union citizenship cannot result from a commercial transaction. That ruling terminated the last remaining route to buy a European Union passport outright. Until that morning, €600,000 of contribution over 36 months, or $750,000 over 12, plus a property purchase of at least $700,000 or a lease at $16,000 a year for 5 years, plus a €10,000 donation to a non-governmental organisation, bought you the freedom of 27 countries. Now, it buys you nothing. Malta was the last one because Cyprus had already gone. The Cypriot programme collapsed on the 13th of October 2020, one day after Al Jazeera broadcast an undercover investigation showing the Speaker of the Cypriot Parliament and a sitting Member of Parliament expressing willingness to assist a fictitious convicted criminal in obtaining a passport. The scheme was abolished with effect from the 1st of November. Over 7 years it had brought in somewhere around $8 billion. Portugal removed the real estate route from its golden visa under the Mise Habitat law that came into force around October of 2023. That route had accounted for roughly 3/4 of all applications. Greece restructured in September of 2024 into a tiered system where the prime zones Attica, Thessaloniki, Mykonos, Santorini and the larger islands now cost €800,000 rather than 250,000. Put the two trends beside each other. Demand from the citizens of stable Western democracies is rising at a rate measured in multiples. Supply is being withdrawn by legislation and court ruling. Prices are climbing. Qualifying thresholds are climbing. Deadlines are being announced with months of notice. There is a word for a market where the demand curve is vertical and the supply is being politically removed. The word is a squeeze, and the people currently in that squeeze are not amateurs. They can see the door narrowing as clearly as you can see it now, and they are moving faster because of it, which narrows it further, because every squeeze is also a stampede. We are going to come back to that dynamic in a very dark way when we get to Germany in the 1930s. For now, just log it. Exit windows do not stay open. They are open, and then they are closing, and then they are shut, and the interval between the second and third of those states is historically much shorter than anyone inside it expects. But if you want the single cleanest piece of evidence that the American position specifically has changed, forget the passports for a moment and look at the humiliation that nobody in the United States seems to have registered. In 2025, the American passport fell out of the top 10 of the Henley Passport Index for the first time in the 20-year history of that index. It dropped to 12th, offering visa-free or visa-on-arrival access to 180 of 227 destinations. 12th, behind a list of countries that most Americans could not confidently place on a map. Now, a passport index is a fairly silly instrument, and I do not want to overstate it. It measures a bureaucratic reciprocity relationship, not national greatness, and moving from 10th to 12th is not the fall of Rome. But it is a data point that fits a pattern rather than contradicting it, and the pattern is that the practical cash value of American citizenship as an instrument, as a thing you hold and use, is declining at the exact moment its holders have started buying alternatives, at a rate that broke the industry's own records. Which brings us to the United Kingdom, because Britain is the case where we can actually watch the mechanism operate in something close to real time, and where the argument about what any of this means gets its first serious test. In April of 2025, the British government abolished the non-domiciled tax regime. Non-dom status was a genuine oddity, a relic of the colonial administration that allowed people who lived in Britain but claimed a permanent home elsewhere to keep their foreign income outside the reach of British tax. It had been politically indefensible for about 20 years and legally durable for 200. Then it was gone. And 16,500 millionaires left, or so the headline says. Here is where I have to slow down and be honest with you, because this is precisely the kind of number that gets repeated 10,000 times without anybody checking it, and I would rather lose the drama than hand you something that falls apart the first time somebody pushes on it. Sebastian Sauerborn, an independent advisor with no stake in Henley's book of business, has gone through those projections and found them wanting. He points out that the same report forecasts Italy gaining 3,600 millionaires, when Italy's flat tax regime has historically attracted somewhere around 1,000 applicants a year, and Italy doubled the minimum charge on that regime in 2024. He calls that figure highly implausible. He calls the German outflow of 400 absurd, and he makes an arithmetic point about Britain that deserves a moment. Henley counts only individuals with $1 million or more in liquid investable assets, which is about 600,000 people in the United Kingdom. 16,500 of 600,000 is 2.7% of the entire class, leaving in 12 months. That is either the most dramatic elite flight from a group of 7 country in the post-war era, or it is a firm that sells relocation services publishing a number that makes relocation look urgent. I lean toward the number being directionally real and specifically inflated, and I will tell you why. The corroborating evidence does not come from Henley. It comes from the tax receipts, from the estate agents in Mayfair, from the family office formation statistics in Dubai and Milan and Singapore, from the departure filings. Multiple independent instruments are moving the same direction. The magnitude is contested, the direction is not, and that distinction between a contested magnitude and an uncontested direction is going to matter enormously later, because it is exactly the distinction that separates the honest version of this argument from the version you have seen on the internet with the ominous music. Which brings us to the bunkers, and I need to handle these carefully, because the bunkers are simultaneously the most famous part of this story and the least useful. Start with the one that is fully documented, because it is documented in the most boring way imaginable, which is why it is credible. In December of 2023, Wired published an investigation into a construction project on the north shore of Kauai in Hawaii called Kulau Ranch. The reporting was not built on anonymous sources or leaked photographs. It was built on county planning documents, the paperwork that any large construction project generates and files, and permits that anyone with patience and a records request can obtain. The property runs to about 1,400 acres. The land alone cost around $170 million. The projected total build cost is north of $270 million. The plans show more than 30 bedrooms across 2 mansions totaling roughly 57,000 square feet, 11 tree houses connected by rope bridges, independent energy generation, independent food production, and an 18-foot water tank. They also show a 5,000 square foot underground structure, accessed through a door made of metal and filled with concrete, containing its own living space, its own mechanical room, and an escape hatch. The property belongs to Mark Zuckerberg. Asked about it by Bloomberg, he said it was just like a little shelter, and compared it to a basement, and said the doomsday framing had been blown out of proportion. I am giving you his denial because he is entitled to it, and because you should have both halves. But I would note, as neutrally as I can manage, that most basements do not have escape hatches, and that the reason a shelter needs an escape hatch is that the designer has considered the possibility that the main entrance will be obstructed from the outside. Then there is Peter Thiel in New Zealand, which is documented in an even more unusual way, through the primary records of the New Zealand Department of Internal Affairs, released after a journalist requested them. Thiel was granted New Zealand citizenship on the 30th of June, 2011. He had spent 12 days in the country. The normal residency requirement at the time was 1,350 days. The grant was made under Section 9, Subsection 1, Clause C of the Citizenship Act, the Exceptional Circumstances provision. The ceremony did not take place in New Zealand. It took place at the New Zealand Consulate in Santa Monica, California, in August of that year, to calibrate how exceptional those exceptional circumstances were. 92 discretionary grants of that kind were made in the entire period from 2011 to 2017, against roughly 152,000 applications. He subsequently bought a lifestyle block near Wanaka, around 18 acres, for something in the region of $13.5 million. He applied to build a lodge on it. The Queenstown Lakes District Council refused. He appealed. The Environment Court also refused, on the grounds that the structure would damage the landscape, and Larry Ellison bought an island, not a house on an island. In 2012 he purchased 98% of Lanai, roughly 88,000 of its 90,000 acres, from Castle and Cook, for a reported $300 million. These are all real, all sourced, all verifiable. And now I am going to argue against my own material, because if I do not do it, somebody in the comments will do it for me, and they will be right. The bunkers are the weakest evidence in this entire investigation. Here is the misconception, and it is one that essentially every treatment of this subject falls into. The assumption is that the extreme physical preparation is the strongest signal, because it is the most dramatic. A billionaire building a concrete room under a Hawaiian hillside feels like proof of something. It photographs well, it generates headlines. It is the image on the thumbnail of every video ever made about this topic, including, in all honesty, probably this one. But physical shelter is the one form of hedging that is fully explained by ordinary, unremarkable human behaviour among the very rich. Wealthy people have bought remote land throughout recorded history. They bought it in Roman Campania and Edwardian Scotland and Gilded Age Newport. A man with $200 billion building an elaborate compound is doing what men with disproportionate fortunes have always done, and the presence of a reinforced basement in a building that also contains 11 treehouses tells you rather less about his risk model than the treehouses tell you about his budget. There is also the status dimension, which Reid Hoffman himself described with unusual candour when he talked about the whole subject having the character of a private handshake, a shared signal among people who have all made the same arrangement. Once a behaviour becomes a marker of membership, it stops being a reliable indicator of belief. Half the people doing it are doing it because the other half are doing it. And then there is the statistic. The single most quoted number in this entire genre comes from an article by Evan Osnos published in The New Yorker on the 30th of January, 2017, titled Doomsday Prep for the Super Rich. The article contains a sentence reporting Hoffman's estimate that more than 50% of Silicon Valley billionaires have some form of apocalypse insurance. That number has been reproduced thousands of times. It has appeared in books, in documentaries, in parliamentary submissions. There was no survey behind it, and there was no study. What there was is one well-connected man's off-the-cuff estimate about his acquaintances, offered in conversation to a magazine writer, and nobody has verified it in the 9 years since. I am not saying it is wrong. It may well be right. I am saying that the load-bearing statistic at the centre of the public conversation about elite collapse preparation is an unsourced personal guess, and that the fact nobody has bothered to check it in 9 years should tell you something about how seriously this subject is actually being treated by the institutions that would normally check things. That is the first of several moments in this story where you will notice a strange absence. There is no government agency, no central bank, no international body, and no serious academic program that systematically tracks the aggregate hedging behaviour of a country's wealthiest 1,000 families as an indicator of institutional stress. We track consumer confidence, we track purchasing manager indices, we track the yield curve with religious devotion. We do not track whether the people who own the country are quietly arranging not to be part of it. And we do not track it despite the fact that every historical case we are going to examine in the second half of this video shows the indicator moving before anything else did. The data exists. It is scattered across land registries, immigration statistics, trust filings, customs declarations, and central bank reserve reports. Nobody has ever been given the job of assembling it, and I have come to think that is not an oversight. But there is one account of elite preparation that I do think matters, and it matters for a reason that has nothing to do with bunkers. Douglas Rushkoff is a media theorist at the City University of New York. In 2017, he was invited to give what he assumed was a keynote address at a conference. The fee was roughly half his annual salary as a professor. He was flown to a remote resort, taken to a back room, and found 5 men waiting for him at a round table. No audience, no stage. They were hedge fund and technology principals, and they wanted a consultation. They spent the session working through scenarios. They had a euphemism for what they were preparing for. They called it the event, and the event covered everything from environmental collapse to social unrest, to a nuclear exchange to a pandemic to a catastrophic systems breach. They asked about New Zealand versus Alaska. They asked about air filtration. And then one of them asked the question that Rushkoff built an entire book around. And it is the question that turned this from a story about rich men buying insurance into something considerably stranger. He asked how he could maintain authority over his security force after the event. Sit with the structure of that question for a second, because the assumption stack underneath it is enormous. It assumes the collapse of the currency, which is why the guards can no longer simply be paid. It assumes the collapse of contract enforcement, which is why their employment agreements become meaningless. It assumes the collapse of the state's monopoly on violence, which is why the guards become the only relevant power in the compound. And having assumed all of that, it asks for a technical solution to the resulting problem. The solutions they discussed among themselves included combination locks on the food supply, disciplinary collars of some kind, and eventually replacing the humans with robots. Rushkoff's own reading, which he set out in Survival of the Richest in 2022, is that the bunker is a metaphor for a way of living that has already become disconnected. I think that is true, and I think it is also too gentle. Because notice what those 5 men were not asking about. They were not asking how to prevent the event. They were not asking what could be repaired, or funded, or lobbied for, or fixed. Not one of the scenarios on the table involved the possibility of the system continuing. They had moved past that entirely in private, while continuing to operate very publicly inside institutions whose entire premise is that the system continues. They had, in the most literal sense available, stopped being invested in the outcome. Hold that. It is going to be the whole thing. If you want to see the hedge that actually matters, stop looking at the concrete and start looking at the paperwork. The concrete is the part they let you photograph. Begin with gold, because gold is the one asset in the world whose entire function is to be useful when nothing else works. It generates no yield, it does nothing, it sits in a vault and costs money to guard. The only rational reason to hold a large quantity of it is a belief that at some point in the future, the instruments that currently work will stop working. According to the World Gold Council, central banks worldwide bought 1,082 tons of gold in 2022. That was described in the Council's own reporting as the highest level of net purchases since 1950. In 2023, they bought 1,037 tons, the second highest annual figure ever recorded. In 2024, approximately 1,045 tons. 3 consecutive years above 1,000 tons. For context, the average across the 12 years from 2010 to 2021 was around 473 tons a year. The buying more than doubled and stayed there. In the first half of 2025, the pace came off somewhat, down around 21% year on year to roughly 415 tons. And I want to flag that honestly, because it is the first indicator on this dashboard that has cooled. It is still well above the long-term norm. It is no longer at a record. But the tonnage is not the interesting part. The timing is. The buying accelerated sharply in 2022. What happened in 2022 is that the United States, the European Union and their allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank foreign exchange reserves in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Consider what that demonstrated to every finance ministry on earth. A sovereign state's reserves, held in the correspondent accounts of Western banks, denominated in dollars and euros, considered the safest assets in existence, turned out to be revocable, not seizable through some lengthy legal process, revocable administratively in an afternoon. The response was immediate, and it was global, and it was not confined to countries that expected to invade anyone. Poland announced a target of 30% of its reserves in gold. India repatriated 100 tons from the Bank of England in 2024, physically moving the metal back onto its own soil at real cost and real logistical difficulty, because a claim on gold held in London had been revealed as a fundamentally different thing from gold held in Mumbai. Understand what this is. The institutions responsible for managing the reserve currency system are, with their own balance sheets, hedging against the reserve currency system. Call that a market view if you like. It looks to me like the fire brigade buying flood insurance on the fire station. And nobody said anything. There was no summit. There was no communique. There was no acknowledgement from any monetary authority that the foundational assumption of the post-1944 financial order, that dollar reserves are a neutral instrument rather than a political one, had been tested and found conditional. Central bankers simply began, quietly and in enormous volume, buying the one asset that cannot be switched off from another country. That silence is a pattern you will see repeatedly in this story, and it is worth naming it now for what it is. It is not conspiracy. There is no room where this is coordinated. It is something more mundane and much harder to fight, which is a professional culture in which certain observations are career limiting to make out loud, so everyone acts on them and nobody says them. And the public record ends up containing the actions with none of the reasoning. Which brings me to the part of this story that made me genuinely angry, and I do not say that for effect. You have heard of tax havens. You picture the Cayman Islands, Panama, Switzerland, palm trees and discretion. That picture is roughly 40 years out of date, and the reason it persists is that it is extraordinarily convenient for it to persist. In 1983, the state of South Dakota abolished the rule against perpetuities. That rule is a piece of English common law dating to the 17th century, which exists to stop a dead person controlling property forever. Under it, a trust has to end. Wealth eventually has to re-enter the world and be owned by a living person who can be taxed, sued, divorced, and inherited from. South Dakota removed the expiry date. A trust established there can run indefinitely. Forever in the legal sense of the word. The instrument is called a dynasty trust, and the name is not a metaphor. Assets held in South Dakota trusts stood at around $57 billion a decade ago. Figures presented to a House Ways and Means hearing in 2021, drawn from Institute for Policy Studies research, put the total at around $360 billion. Some counts run past $500 billion across 106 trust companies. The national total across the American onshore trust industry approaches $1 trillion. The mechanism became visible to the public exactly once. In October of 2021, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published the Pandora Papers, 11.9 million records worked through by more than 600 journalists. The Panama Papers 5 years earlier had exposed offshore structures used by foreigners. The Pandora Papers exposed something different. They exposed the United States. Investigators identified 206 American trusts linked to individuals and entities from 41 countries, holding more than $1 billion between them. Around 30 were connected to people or companies accused of fraud, bribery, or human rights abuses. A significant node in the reporting was the Sioux Falls office of a firm called Trident Trust. Foreign money accused of foreign crimes, sheltered in South Dakota in perpetuity by legal design. Now here is the structural fact underneath all of it, and it is the single most damning thing in this entire video, and almost nobody knows it. After the 2008 financial crisis, the United States passed the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, known as FATCA. Under it, foreign financial institutions are required to report accounts held by American taxpayers to the Internal Revenue Service, on pain of punitive withholding. It was aggressive, it was extraterritorial, and it worked. Banks all over the world now hand American account data to Washington. In response, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development built a reciprocal version for everyone else. The Common Reporting Standard. Over 100 jurisdictions signed it. They exchange account information with each other automatically. The United States never joined. Read that again, because the geometry of it is the whole scandal. Information flows into the United States from the entire world. Information does not flow out. If you are a foreign national who wishes to hide assets from your own government, the safest jurisdiction on earth is not a Caribbean island under constant international pressure. It is South Dakota, in a trust that never expires, in a country that has built the most effective financial transparency regime in history and pointed it exclusively outward. The Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index ranks the United States second in the world. The network's own observation about this arrangement is that most countries do not even perceive America as a tax haven, which is precisely what makes it work. The reputational cover is the product. And the response to the Pandora Papers was nothing. Some hearings, some proposed legislation. The rule against perpetuities remains repealed in South Dakota, Nevada, Delaware and Alaska. The trusts remain. The United States remains outside the Common Reporting Standard. 11.9 million documents, 600 journalists, heads of state exposed, and the machine did not miss a beat. Which is the moment, if you are keeping an emotional ledger of this video, where you should notice that the scandal has almost nothing to do with wealthy people hiding money. That has never been news. What should stop you is that the concealment infrastructure was built domestically, by legislatures, in public, through ordinary bills that passed with ordinary votes, and the resulting architecture was reported at full volume by the largest journalistic collaboration ever assembled, and nothing happened. A system in which the exposure of the mechanism produces no change to the mechanism is a system that has already made a decision about who it is for. The obvious question at this point is how much money we are actually talking about, and the honest answer is that nobody knows, and the reason nobody knows is itself part of the story. The best estimates come from Gabriel Zucman, an economist who has spent his career trying to reconcile the world's national accounts. His method is elegant and slightly absurd. If you add up all the financial assets recorded as liabilities in the world's economies and compare them to all the financial assets recorded as being owned by somebody, the two figures should match. They do not. There is a systematic gap running to something in the region of 10% of global gross domestic product, in which the liabilities exist and the owners do not. The planet, on paper, owes a great deal of money to nobody. That missing wealth is the offshore system, and Zucman's work with Annette Alstadster, Sarah Godard and Panayotis Nicolaides at the European Union Tax Observatory has tried to put figures on its structure. Their Global Tax Evasion Report, published in 2024, estimates that more than 60% of Swiss managed offshore wealth sits inside shell structures that make beneficial ownership untraceable. Their headline policy proposal is a 2% minimum tax on the world's billionaires, and to model it they had to construct the population, which came out at around 2,756 individuals holding roughly $13 trillion. The tax would raise around $250 billion a year. I want to be careful with those figures because they are estimates rather than measurements, and different institutions produce materially different ones. The Tax Justice Network's numbers diverge from the tax observatories. Both diverge from the various private wealth reports. There is no register. There cannot be a register, because the entire architecture exists to prevent one, which means every figure in this paragraph is a reconstruction from indirect evidence, and anybody who quotes one of them as a hard number is telling you more about their sourcing than about the world. But the divergence is itself informative. We can measure the mass of a black hole from the orbits of stars we cannot see into. We can measure the depth of an aquifer from the level of a well. We know how much wealth is missing with far more confidence than we know where any of it is, and the gap between those two states of knowledge did not arise from any technical limitation. It was designed deliberately by lawyers for clients over a period of about 50 years, and it works, and there is a physical version of the same thing that almost nobody talks about, which I find genuinely strange given how visually obvious it is. Free ports. The Geneva Freeport, Le Freeport in Singapore, the facility in Luxembourg. These are high-security warehouses located inside customs-free zones, which means that goods stored in them are legally considered to be in transit and are therefore outside the jurisdiction of the country the building is physically standing in. You can store an object indefinitely, sell it to somebody else while it remains in the warehouse. And the object has never technically entered any country and no taxable event has occurred anywhere. The Geneva Freeport is believed to hold one of the largest concentrations of art on Earth. Nobody can confirm that, because the inventory is not public and there is no obligation to make it public. The estimates of the value stored in these facilities run into the tens of billions, and they are guesses. Consider what an object in a free port actually is. It is a Picasso that exists in a legal nowhere, owned through a structure in a jurisdiction that does not report, insured in a third country, changing hands between parties whose identities are not recorded, in a building that a government built specifically to make this possible. It is portable, it is dense, it holds value across regime change, it does not depend on any payment system, and it can be moved by one man in a van. It is a crate of gold going down to the Bund at 3 a.m, with better climate control. Let me do one more asset class, and I want to do it because it is where I have to correct my own side of the argument again. Farmland. You will have seen the claim that Bill Gates is the largest private owner of farmland in the United States. It is true. The land report tracks this, and his holdings run to somewhere between 242,000 and 250,000 acres of farmland across 17 or 18 states, with about 275,000 acres in total including non-agricultural land. The largest single block is in Louisiana at around 69,000 acres, then Arkansas at just under 48,000, then Nebraska at around 20,500. That claim is deployed constantly as evidence of elite accumulation of the fundamental resource, and I am going to tell you plainly that it is a bad argument, and that using it makes you easy to dismiss, and that being easy to dismiss is exactly what you cannot afford when you are making a case this uncomfortable. The United States contains roughly 876 million acres of farmland. 248,000 acres is around 28 thousandths of 1% of it. Gates himself made this point on Reddit in 2023, saying he owns less than 1/4,000th of American farmland and that there is no grand scheme involved. He is right about the arithmetic. Whether there is a scheme is a separate question, and one individual's holdings are the wrong place to look for the answer. The real signal in farmland has nothing to do with any single billionaire. Look instead at the institutional flow. Nuveen and Manulife and TR and the listed vehicles like Farmland Partners and Gladstone Land building agricultural allocations that did not meaningfully exist as an asset class 30 years ago. Farmland has been reclassified in institutional portfolios from a business you operate into a store of value you hold, which is exactly what happens to an asset when large allocators start pricing in the possibility that financial claims may become less reliable than physical ones. Farmland produces a modest yield, resists inflation, cannot be relocated, cannot be frozen from a foreign capital, and does not require the continued existence of any particular payment system to remain valuable. It is gold that grows food. And the same logic runs underneath every single item on this dashboard. Gold that cannot be revoked. Citizenship that cannot be cancelled by the government you were born under. Trusts that cannot be reached by courts or heirs or spouses or tax authorities, and that never, ever expire. Land that cannot be moved. Compounds that generate their own power and their own water on islands that do not depend on a grid. Every one of these is a hedge against the same thing, not against a market falling. Markets fall constantly, and the wealthy make money on the way down. These are hedges against the failure of the institutional layer itself, against the possibility that the courts, the currency, the contracts, and the police stop functioning as reliable instruments. That is the specific risk being priced. institutional failure, and it is being priced simultaneously in 6 different asset classes by 6 different groups of people who mostly do not know each other, at levels that in several cases are the highest ever recorded, which is where somebody sensible stops and says, fine, but people have been predicting the end of the world forever. Show me that this has ever actually meant anything. Good, let us go and look. In the year 408, a young Roman woman named Melania began selling everything her family owned. She was about 25. She belonged to the Valeri, one of the oldest and richest senatorial families in the Roman world, and she had married her cousin Pinyanus, which concentrated 2 enormous fortunes into a single household. Historians now call her Melania the Younger to distinguish her from her grandmother, who had done something similar a generation earlier. The scale of what they owned is difficult to hold in your head. Estates in Italy, in Sicily, in Spain, in Gaul, in North Africa, in Britain. Not farms. Regions, the property was distributed across the entire western half of the empire, which was standard practice for the senatorial aristocracy of that period, and which had the incidental effect of making them the only people in the Roman world whose wealth was not tied to the fate of any particular province. The liquidation was so large it broke the market. There was no private buyer in the Roman world with sufficient liquidity to absorb it. The Emperor Honorius had to intervene personally, and he issued instructions that provincial governors were to act as sale agents for the couple's property, which is a remarkable sentence when you unpack it. The imperial administration was deployed to help a private family convert its fixed assets into portable ones. Palladius, writing later, records that they freed around 8,000 slaves in the process. And then they left, first to Sicily, to the area around Messina, then, in 410, across to North Africa to Thagaste and Hippo, where they became close to Augustine. Then in 417 onward to Jerusalem, where Melania eventually founded monasteries on the Mount of Olives, and where she died in 439. The chronology is the thing. The sale began around 408. Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome on the 24th of August, 410. They were out with roughly 2 years to spare, and they were out in the specific sense that their capital had been converted from land in Italy into gold that travelled with them. Now I have to complicate this, because our main source for Melania's life is a hagiography, a work of devotional biography written by a man called Gerontius, who was her disciple, and the genre has a specific agenda. Gerontius wants to tell a story about total renunciation, about a woman abandoning worldly wealth for God, and that agenda shapes the numbers and the emphasis. There is a serious revisionist reading which argues that Melania and Pinyanus did not in fact impoverish themselves at all, that their income-generating capital was substantially preserved through the transition, and that the renunciation narrative is theological rhetoric applied over what was, in financial terms, a successful restructuring. The clearest genuinely forced sales in the record are the properties in Rome, Spain and Gaul disposed of under the direct threat of Alaric between 408 and 411, which, if anything, makes the case stronger rather than weaker. Strip out the piety, and what remains is a documented instance of the wealthiest family in the Western Empire liquidating its Italian position, converting to portable wealth, relocating first to an island and then to another continent 2 years before the capital fell, with the active administrative assistance of the emperor. But Melania is only the visible edge of it, and if you look at the class rather than the individual, you find something much more disturbing, and it is the thing I want to plant now and come back to at the end. The Roman aristocracy exited the empire decades before it exited the geography. I mean that in a specific, legal, documentable way. Across the 4th and early 5th centuries, the great senatorial families progressively acquired a set of privileges that removed them from the ordinary operation of the state, while leaving them physically present inside it. The most important of these was autopraegia, the right to collect and remit one's own taxes directly to the imperial treasury rather than through the municipal apparatus. On paper, it is an administrative convenience. In practice, it meant the largest landowners in each province were no longer inside the local fiscal system at all, which meant they had no interest in whether that system functioned, which meant the burden of collection fell entirely on everybody else. The mechanism sits in the Theodosian Code, the compilation of imperial legislation issued in 438, and the code is remarkable reading for exactly this reason. It is a record of a state legislating with increasing desperation against the disengagement of its own elite. There are laws requiring curials, the municipal councillors responsible for local administration and tax collection, to remain in their posts, laws forbidding them from entering the church to escape those posts, laws forbidding them from joining the imperial bureaucracy to escape those posts, laws forbidding them from simply leaving town, laws requiring their sons to inherit the obligation. You do not pass a law compelling people to accept a position of local honour unless the position of local honour has become something people are fleeing. At the same time, the practice of euagetism collapsed. Euagetism is the term for elite public spending, the ancient arrangement whereby the rich of a city funded its baths, its games, its aqueducts, its walls and its grain distributions, in exchange for status, inscriptions, and the political consent of everyone else. It was the load-bearing wall of Roman urban civilization, and it was entirely voluntary. Across the 4th and 5th centuries, in city after city, it stops. The inscriptions thin out and then disappear. The construction and repair projects end. The money did not vanish. Olympiodorus of Thebes, writing in the 5th century, recorded the annual incomes of the great senatorial houses in pounds of gold, and the figures he gives are so large that historians have argued about them ever since, with some treating them as reliable testimony and others as rhetorical inflation. Either way, the direction is clear. There were still enormous private fortunes. They had simply stopped being spent on cities, and what they were spent on instead is visible in the ground. Across the western provinces in this period, the archaeology shows sustained, expensive investment in rural villas and increasingly in fortified rural villas. Walls, towers, defensible perimeters, private storage, private production. In some regions, private armed retinues, the bucellarii, personal military households retained by individual landowners, which is a Roman senator in the 4th century building a self-sufficient fortified compound in the countryside with his own security force, having legally exempted himself from the local tax system, while the walls of the nearest city go unrepaired because nobody will pay for them anymore. I am not going to insult you by drawing the parallel explicitly. There is a document from the tail end of this, and it is one of the strangest pieces of writing to survive from the ancient world. In 417, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat named Rutilius Namatianus, who had held the post of urban prefect of Rome itself, wrote a poem called De Reditu Suo, on his return. It describes his journey by sea from Italy back to his estates in Gaul, 7 years after the sack. Rutilius is a pagan, a traditionalist, and a passionate patriot, and the poem contains a long hymn to the eternity of Rome, a genuinely moving passage insisting that the city will rise again as it always has. He writes it while leaving. He takes the sea route because the roads and bridges of Italy are no longer reliable. He passes ruined towns and remarks on them. The most eloquent surviving statement of faith in Rome's future was composed by a member of its governing class in the process of relocating his life away from it, and I do not think he perceived any contradiction, and I think that is the most important detail in the entire poem. People do not experience their own hedging as disloyalty, they experience it as prudence. The story they tell themselves is that they still believe, and the story is sincere, and it is contradicted by their logistics. Now let me give you the counter-evidence, because Roman history is a field where confident narratives go to die. There is a body of scholarship associated with Chris Wickham among others, which reads this entire period not as collapse, but as transformation. On that reading, the aristocracy adapted. Regional elites became local powers, then became the nobility of the successor kingdoms, and much of what looks like catastrophe from the vantage point of the imperial centre looks like continuity from the vantage point of a Gallic estate. Against that, you have Brian Ward Perkins and Peter Heather arguing forcefully that something genuinely terrible happened, and that the material evidence, the collapse in pottery quality, the disappearance of long-distance trade, the shrinking of livestock, the end of literacy outside the church, describes a fall in living standards that no amount of scholarly delicacy should soften. I find Ward Perkins persuasive on the material evidence, and Wickham persuasive on the elite continuity, and I think both being true is the actual horror of it. The system collapsed. The people at the top of it largely did not. They arrived on the other side as the aristocracy of the Visigothic and Frankish kingdoms, having successfully transitioned their capital across the discontinuity, while the pottery got worse for everybody else for 400 years. There is one more strand of evidence, and it is the one I trust least, which is why I want to tell you about it properly. Coin hoards. Across Roman Britain in particular, and across the western provinces generally, the 4th and early 5th centuries produce a striking density of buried coin hoards. The Hoxton hoard in Suffolk, found in 1992, contains around 15,000 coins, along with gold jewellery and silver tableware. The Cunesio hoard from Wiltshire contains close to 55,000. The Portable Antiquities scheme has recorded thousands of smaller finds. The intuitive reading is that people buried their wealth because they were frightened, and that a spike in hoarding is a proxy for elite panic. It is a lovely idea, and the archaeology does not straightforwardly support it. A buried hoard is by definition a hoard that was never recovered, which means hoard density measures failure to return rather than frequency of burial. Hoarding may reflect ritual deposition, or ordinary banking practice in a world without banks, or currency reform making old coin worthless, or a dozen other things. The scholarship is genuinely unresolved, and anyone who tells you the hoards prove panic is overselling. I include it because I want you to see me discard something that would have been useful to me. The hoards are the kind of evidence that makes a good documentary and a bad argument, and if I keep the hoards I have to give you the 15,000 coins in the Hoxton hoard without the caveat, and then the whole thing becomes a mood instead of a case. What survives the scrutiny is this. In the century before the Western Empire ceased to function, its wealthiest families systematically exempted themselves from its tax system, stopped funding its cities, fortified their private estates, retained private armed forces, distributed their landholdings across multiple provinces so that no single political collapse could ruin them, and in the most acute moments converted fixed property into portable gold and physically relocated ahead of the violence. Every element of that is documented in law codes, in archaeology, in imperial legislation, and in the letters and poems of the people doing it. And here is the part that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I found it, and it is the second time in this video I am going to ask you to hold on to something before I can explain it properly. The Roman elite were not wrong. The empire did fall. Their hedging was, in the narrow sense, vindicated, but they were not forecasting. Look at the sequence again. The tax exemptions came first. The withdrawal of urban funding came first. The fortification came first. The relocation came last, and by the time it came, the thing they were relocating away from had already been hollowed out by the earlier moves. The senatorial families did not exit an empire that was failing. They stopped paying for an empire, stopped defending an empire, stopped funding the cities of an empire, and then, some decades later, the empire failed. They were not reading the odds. They were setting them. France gives us the same pattern with the timeline compressed into a single generation, and it also gives me an opportunity to demolish a claim that I have seen repeated in almost every treatment of this subject, including several that I otherwise respect. The claim is that the French nobility exported its capital in the years before 1789, quietly moving assets abroad while publicly maintaining that the monarchy was secure. It is a satisfying story. It fits the thesis. and when you go looking for the evidence, it is thin to the point of transparency. What is overwhelmingly documented is what happened after. More than 100,000 people left France between 1789 and 1794. And although they are collectively remembered as the aristocracy, the majority were actually members of the Third Estate. They left in identifiable waves. The Comte d'Artois and the Comte de Provence, both brothers of the king, were gone within weeks of the fall of the Bastille in 1789. Military officers left in large numbers through 1791 and 1792. Particularly after the royal family's failed flight to Varennes in June of 1791 made the monarchy's own position obvious. The largest wave followed the September massacres of 1792. They gathered at Koblenz on the Rhine, in London, in Turin, in Vienna, in Hamburg. The London community alone reached around 40,000. The state's response is instructive because it is the second time in this story we watch an exit window slam. A decree of the 9th of November, 1791, ordered migrants to return on pain of death, which Louis XVI vetoed. A law of the 8th of April, 1792, declared their property forfeit. The National Convention banished them in perpetuity on the 23rd of October, 1792. Church property had already been nationalised on the 2nd of November, 1789, valued at around 3 billion livres, and the confiscated estates of the Migers were added to the same pool and auctioned off as biens nationaux. The scale of that transfer is one of the largest peacetime redistributions of property in European history, and we can reconstruct much of it with unusual precision because of the indemnity process of the 1820s, when the restored monarchy compensated the heirs and generated an enormous documentary record in the process. That is the real evidence. It is post-revolutionary, not pre-revolutionary, and I am telling you that plainly because if I let the pre-1789 capital flight claim stand, it would strengthen this video and weaken the argument, and the argument is the thing I actually care about. But France gives us something better than a capital flight story, and it is more damning, and hardly anybody tells it. In 1787, the French crown was insolvent, not metaphorically. Debt service was consuming an enormous share of state revenue, and successive controllers general had run out of ways to roll it forward. The finance minister Calonne proposed a solution that was, by the standards of the ancient argument, radical a universal land tax, payable by everyone, including the nobility and the clergy, whose exemptions had been the central structural fact of French public finance for centuries. Because a normal parliament would have refused, the Crown convened an assembly of notables, hand-picked from the aristocracy, the senior clergy and the magistracy. These were the men with the most to lose from a French collapse, the men whose entire position depended on the continued existence of the monarchy, the men with better information about the state of the Treasury than anyone else in France. They refused. They refused a tax on themselves that would have stabilised the state that guaranteed their property, their titles, their offices, and their heads. They refused it in 1787, and the refusal forced the calling of the Estates General, and the Estates General became the National Assembly, and within 6 years the Assembly of Notables was a category of person being transported to the Place de la Révolution in a cart. The venality of office is the other half of it. In France you could buy a public position outright, and it became heritable property, and the crown sold them to raise money the way a modern state sells bonds. The result over 2 centuries was an inflation of the office-holding class. The number of positions multiplied. The number of families holding claims to elite status multiplied faster. The legal profession swelled with trained, ambitious, credentialed men who had bought or inherited a stake in a system that could no longer provide all of them with the status their credentials implied. Hold that thought too, because there is a name for that condition, and we are going to get to it shortly. The pattern in France is therefore not a story about elites fleeing and approaching danger. What actually happened is that the elite refused to pay for the maintenance of the thing protecting them, and then, once it broke, fled the consequences. The refusal came first, the flight came second, and the interval between them was 18 months, which takes us back to Shanghai and to George Vine at his window, because the Chinese case is the one where we can see the entire cycle repeat across 4 separate ruptures in a single century, involving in some cases the same families. 1911, the fall of the Qing. 1927, the Shanghai coup. 1937, the Japanese invasion. 1945 to 1949, the Civil War and the nationalist collapse. 1966, the Cultural Revolution. 1997, the handover. And then 2019 through 2021. At every single one of those hinges, the Chinese commercial gentry moved, and they moved to the same short list of places. Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, the Straits Settlements, later Vancouver and Sydney and London. The 1948-49 episode is the best documented, and it is not only about the government's gold. While Cabot was cabling Washington about the Hedging, the Shanghai industrialists were conducting a private version of the same operation, and theirs was in some ways more impressive, because you cannot carry a factory in a crate. Families in the cotton and textile trade dismantled machinery, shipped it south, and rebuilt in Hong Kong, which at that point was a war-damaged intrepid with no manufacturing base worth speaking of. The Hong Kong textile industry, which underwrote the colony's transformation over the following 3 decades, was substantially founded by Shanghai capital that had physically relocated ahead of the communist advance. Those families did not know the outcome of the Civil War. Nobody did, in 1947. What they had was a sense, derived from proximity to the actual condition of the nationalist administration rather than its announcements, that the probability distribution had shifted enough to justify the enormous cost of moving, and now do the modern version, because it is happening at a scale that dwarfs any of it. The Monetary Authority of Singapore reports that the number of single-family offices operating in Singapore grew from 400 at the end of 2020 to more than 2,000 by the end of 2024. Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong gave that figure to Parliament on the 5th of February, 2025. A single-family office is a private company that exists to manage the wealth of one household. 400 to 2,000 in 4 years, and the largest single source of that growth was mainland Chinese wealth. The Chinese internet, in the same period, produced a term for what was happening. Runxiu, the character means to run, and it puns on the English word, and the study of it became a genuine online subculture in the years after the property crisis and the lockdowns. It is not a political movement. There is no manifesto. It is a body of practical knowledge about how to leave, shared between people who have concluded that the future they were promised is not going to be delivered. And it's circulated among exactly the professional and commercial classes that a growing economy is supposed to bind to itself. And I could keep going, and the fact that I could keep going is itself the argument. Iran. 1977 and 1978, the Bazari merchant families and the circle around the court moved money out of Tehran, while the Shah was still receiving state visits, and the American embassy was still filing optimistic assessments. The revolution came in February of 1979. Cuba, 1958. Havana's commercial families began liquidating during the final year of Batista, and the ones who moved in 58 kept something, and the ones who waited for the situation to clarify in 1960 and 1961 did not. Russia, twice. The 1990s, when the country's new wealth left almost as fast as it was created and never fully came back. Then again after 2014, and again in 2022, when the outflow was so large that the state had to impose emergency capital controls within days. Venezuela, across the whole span from 1998 to about 2015, where the professional and commercial classes departed in sequence, in the correct order, sorted almost perfectly by how much information they had. 4 countries, 4 political systems, 4 centuries of institutional difference between the oldest and the newest, and the same behaviour in the same order every time. But there is one more case I need to give you, and it is the one that keeps me up, and it is the reason I have been repeating the phrase exit window like a man with a tic. Germany. 1931. In December of that year, under emergency decree, the Weimar government introduced the Reichsfluchtsteuer, the Reich flight tax. It was a Weimar measure, not a Nazi one, introduced by a democratic republic in a fiscal emergency for an entirely defensible reason, which was to stop capital hemorrhaging out of a country in the depths of the Depression. It applied to anyone leaving Germany with assets above a threshold, taking a percentage of their net worth on the way out. It was a reasonable law passed by a legitimate government for a legitimate purpose. Within 18 months, that legitimate government was gone, and the machinery it had built for keeping wealth inside German borders was inherited intact by a regime with entirely different intentions. The threshold was progressively lowered, the rate was raised. It was combined with currency controls that made it nearly impossible to convert marks into anything usable abroad. And it was applied, with escalating ferocity, to the specific population that most urgently needed to leave. The people who moved capital in 1931 and 1932, when it looked panicky and pessimistic and slightly disloyal to do so, preserved it. The people who waited until the situation was clear enough that moving was obviously correct found that the correct action was no longer available. The window did not close when the danger arrived. It closed years before, at the exact moment the danger became legible to ordinary people. That is the mechanism that makes this entire subject genuinely serious, rather than merely interesting. Exit is not a decision you make when you see the threat. Exit is a decision you make while everyone around you thinks you are being ridiculous, or you do not make it at all, and the people currently buying Grenadian passports at $235,000 a unit, while the European Court of Justice shuts the last European route, and Portugal deletes its property track, and the thresholds climb every year, are not stupid. They have read this history. Several of them have read it more carefully than I have. Which brings us, finally, to the question I have been avoiding for an hour. Are they right? There is a man who has spent 30 years building a mathematical model designed to answer exactly that question, and the reason his name generates such heat is that the model produced a specific, dated, published prediction, and then the date arrived. Peter Turchin trained as a population biologist. He spent the first half of his career modelling the boom and bust cycles of forest insects, working out why certain beetle populations explode and crash on roughly regular intervals. Then, in the early 2000s, he turned the same apparatus onto human societies and called the resulting discipline Cliodynamics, after Clio, the muse of history. The central claim is that complex agrarian and industrial societies pass through long waves of integration and disintegration, and that the disintegrative phase is driven by 3 quantifiable pressures acting together. Popular immiseration, meaning a decline in living standards for the majority. Declining state fiscal capacity, meaning the government's revenues fail to keep pace with its obligations. And the one that does the real work in the model, elite overproduction. Elite overproduction is a concept that sounds mild and is not. Every society produces a limited number of genuine elite positions, seats in a legislature, partnerships in the firms that matter, positions on the boards that decide things, chairs at the universities that confer status. That number is roughly fixed by the structure of the society, and it changes only slowly. The number of people credentialed, wealthy, and ambitious enough to expect one of those positions is not fixed at all. It can grow very fast, particularly during a period of rising inequality, because rising inequality does 2 things simultaneously. It concentrates wealth at the top which increases the number of families with the resources to produce elite aspirants, and it makes the gap between elite and non-elite status so large that the competition for the remaining positions becomes existential rather than merely competitive. When the number of aspirants outruns the number of positions, you get a surplus, and a surplus of highly educated, well-resourced, thwarted people who believe themselves entitled to power is, in Turchin's model, the single most reliable predictor of political instability that exists. Not poverty. Poverty produces suffering. Thwarted elites produce organised political violence because they are the only people with the resources, the education and the networks to organise anything. This is the French venality of office 400 years later with the doctorate. The indicators Turchin actually tracks for the United States are worth naming because they are unglamorous and mostly public. The ratio of the largest fortunes to median wages, the number of law degrees and business degrees awarded relative to available positions in law and management, the cost of running for federal office, which is a direct measure of how many people are competing for a fixed number of seats, the number of individuals holding more than $10 million and more than $100 million, set against the number of actual positions of power available to them, and a general index of physical well-being, including life expectancy and average height, which is a proxy for the immiseration term. He aggregates these into what he calls the political stress indicator, and in 2010 he published a short piece in Nature in which he stated that the coming decade was likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe, and that the relevant cycles looked set to peak in the years around 2020. He wrote that in 2010. I have been careful with how I phrase that, because there is a version of this story where I tell you a scientist predicted the future and you should be alarmed, and that version is dishonest, and I would rather do the harder thing. Turchin himself is quite clear about what the model does. His own analogy is that structural demographic theory predicts the forest fire, not the spark. It tells you that the undergrowth is dry and the density is high and the conditions for a large fire are present. It cannot tell you which cigarette, which lightning strike, which afternoon. This distinction matters enormously, because a model that predicts elevated probability over a decade is not falsifiable in the way a model that predicts an event on a date is falsifiable. And the difference between those two things is the difference between science and astrology. Now let me give you the case against him properly, because I promised at the start that I would not hide from the counter-argument, and this is where the counter-argument gets serious enough that it very nearly ends this video. Cliodynamics has three substantial problems. The first is data selection. The historical record is enormous and irregular, and the coding decisions required to turn it into a time series are numerous and contestable. When you decide what counts as an instability event, what counts as an elite, and how to weight a peasant revolt in 14th century England against a coup in 19th century Peru, you make hundreds of judgment calls. And every one of those calls has the potential to import your conclusion into your data. The Sechat databank, the enormous historical dataset that underpins much of this work, has been the subject of genuine and sustained academic dispute on precisely these grounds. The second is post hoc fitting. Any sufficiently flexible cyclical model can be tuned to fit a historical series after the fact. The test of such a model is out-of-sample prediction, and the number of genuine out-of-sample predictions in this field is small, and one of them is the 2010 Nature piece, which is a single data point and which its author acknowledges was a probability statement rather than an event forecast. The third is the falsifiability problem, and it is the one I keep coming back to. If instability rises, the model is confirmed. If instability does not rise, the model says the pressure is still accumulating and the fire has not started yet. A theory that cannot be embarrassed by any observation is a theory that is not doing the work theories are supposed to do. Turchin has answers to all three, and some of them are good. But I want you to hold the objections, because I am about to do something considerably worse to the argument I've spent an hour and a half building. Before I do, let me establish that the underlying conditions the model describes are not in dispute, whatever you think of the model. The Federal Reserve's distributional financial accounts show the top 1% of American households holding around 30.8% of net worth in 2024 and a record 31.7% in the third quarter of 2025. In 1989, that figure was 22.8%. The top 0.1% holds around 14%. The bottom half of the country holds around 2.5%. You will see a different set of numbers quoted elsewhere, drawn from the World Inequality Database and the capitalization work of Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, which puts the top 0.1% share closer to 22%, a level they describe as almost matching 1929. Those two sets of figures are not compatible and should never be quoted in the same breath, which people do constantly. They use different units, households versus tax units, and different methods for imputing wealth from income. Report them separately or do not report them at all. The direction, once again, is not in dispute by anyone. Oxfam ran the Federal Reserve numbers to produce a comparison I have not been able to shake. Between 1989 and 2022, a household in the top 0.1% gained around $39.5 million in wealth. A household in the bottom 20% gained under $8,500, and in June of 2021, ProPublica published an analysis of leaked Internal Revenue Service data covering 405,427 tax returns. It found that between 2014 and 2018, the wealth of the 25 richest Americans grew by around $401 billion, while they paid $13.6 billion in federal income tax. They called the resulting ratio a true tax rate of 3.4%. Warren Buffett's figure came out at 0.1%. Jeff Bezos paid no federal income tax at all in 2007 and again in 2011. The critique of that framing is legitimate, and I will give it to you. True tax rate measures tax paid against unrealized gains in asset values, and unrealized gains are not income under American law, which means the denominator is a quantity that has never been taxed anywhere and was never intended to be. ProPublica alleged no illegality by anyone. It is a rhetorical construction rather than a measurement of tax avoidance. It is also, and this is why it landed the way it did, an entirely accurate description of what it feels like to live in the country the numbers describe. Turchin's model says this configuration is unstable. A surplus of thwarted elites, a majority whose position is deteriorating, and a state whose revenues cannot keep pace. Three pressures, all present, all measurable, all moving the same direction for 4 decades. And now, let me take it apart. Everything I have shown you rests on a single unstated assumption, and I have been letting you carry it for 90 minutes without examining it, which is exactly what every other treatment of this subject does. The assumption is that the people doing the hedging know what they are doing. The entire emotional force of this material depends on it. When you look at Melania liquidating in 408, or the Shanghai families dismantling their looms in 1948, or an American family buying a Grenadian passport in 2025, the thing that makes your stomach drop is the idea that these people have better information than you do and are acting on it, that they can see something, that the wealthy are, functionally, an early warning system, and the alarm is going off. That assumption is almost certainly false, and the evidence against it is overwhelming. And it comes from the single most rigorous body of research ever conducted on the question of whether well-informed, high-status people can predict anything at all. Philip Tetlock is a psychologist who spent roughly 2 decades running what remains the largest controlled study of expert political forecasting ever attempted. He recruited 284 experts, people with genuine credentials in political science, economics, area studies, intelligence and journalism, the exact demographic that advises governments and manages capital. He asked them to make specific, resolvable predictions about political and economic outcomes, with probabilities attached, so that the results could be scored rather than argued about. By the end, he had 82,361 forecasts. The results, published as Expert Political Judgment in 2005, are among the most quietly devastating findings in the social sciences. The average expert performed at a level tetlock compared to a dart-throwing chimpanzee. Against simple statistical baselines, the experts did badly. Against attentive readers of a good newspaper, they did no better. And then there is the finding that I think about more than any other. Within his sample, accuracy was inversely related to fame. The experts most in demand, most quoted, most invited to advise, most likely to be sitting in a room with 5 hedge fund principals at a remote resort were on average the least accurate members of the group. The mechanism is not mysterious. Confident, unhedged, dramatic forecasts get you invited back. Careful, probabilistic ones do not. The selection pressure on public expertise runs directly against calibration. Apply that to everything I have told you. The people buying second passports are not a panel of super forecasters. They are wealthy individuals acting on the recommendations of advisors who are selected for confidence in an industry that profits from urgency at a moment when the media environment rewards catastrophism. Calling that an early warning system flatters it enormously. What it resembles is a market for anxiety with a distribution network, and their track record is available for inspection. The financial elite of the United States and Europe, with the best information, the best analysts, and the strongest incentive of anyone alive to get it right, failed to anticipate the 2008 crisis, which originated inside their own institutions. In an asset class they had themselves constructed, using models they had themselves written. They failed on Brexit, where the betting markets and the money were wrong until the early hours of the morning. They failed on the 2020 pandemic, where the World Economic Forum had run a simulation of a global pandemic mere months prior, and the world's largest asset managers still did not reposition until the market had already fallen. 3 of the largest shocks of the last 20 years, and in every case the informed classes were not merely no better than the public. They were arguably worse, because they had more invested in the model that was about to break. Now stack the base rate objection on top of that, because it is the strongest single argument against everything in this video. Wealthy people buy remote land, gold, foreign property and bolt holes. They always have. Doing so signals nothing whatsoever about the future. It is simply what having a great deal of money looks like. If you build a dataset of elite hedging behaviour with no baseline, you will find elite hedging behaviour in every period of history you examine, including all of the ones that were followed by 200 years of stability. The medieval nobility fortified their houses continuously for 6 centuries. The Victorian rich bought Scottish estates. Nobody reads those as collapse indicators, because nothing collapsed, and we only reach for the collapse reading when we already know how the story ends. That is survivorship bias, and it is doing an enormous amount of unacknowledged work in the historical section of this video. I selected Rome, France, China and Germany. I selected them because they are cases where elite hedging was followed by rupture. There is no chapter in this video about the many periods in which elites hedged energetically and nothing whatsoever happened, and there is no chapter because those periods do not generate a narrative, and I want to be honest that the absence is a choice I made rather than a feature of the world. Here are some false positives, since I have not given you any. Between roughly 1955 and 1965, a substantial portion of the American professional and business class built fallout shelters. There was nothing fringe about it. It was federal policy, it was in Life magazine, it was in suburban back gardens across the country, and it was rational in the sense that the probability of nuclear exchange was genuinely non-zero and the consequences were total. Millions of dollars of private capital went into the ground. The society in question then proceeded to have the most prosperous 3 decades in its history. The year 2000 computer scare produced another wave of it. Serious people with serious information moved to rural properties, stockpiled supplies, and prepared for infrastructure failure at the end of 1999. The rollover happened. Some cash machines misbehaved. That was all. Every generation produces a cohort of the wealthy who conclude that the end is structurally imminent, and the overwhelming majority of them have been wrong, and their wrongness leaves no monument, and the small number who are right get books written about them. And then there is the motivation problem, which is the least dramatic and possibly the most fatal. When you actually survey the people buying these products, they do not describe apocalypse. The attitudes work published by Knight Frank in its wealth report, the billionaire ambitions research from UBS, and the industry's own client surveys consistently produce the same mundane list of drivers. Tax, education for children, business access to particular markets, healthcare, climate and lifestyle. Political dissatisfaction, yes, but of the ordinary kind that has always caused people to move countries, not of the kind that involves a concrete room. The American surge specifically has an entirely boring explanation available, and I would be dishonest to withhold it. Wealth tax proposals at state level. A political environment in which both major factions periodically threaten measures that would be expensive for the wealthy. A passport whose practical utility has slipped. Estate planning, and, not trivially, an industry that has spent 5 years and a great deal of money marketing directly to Americans for the first time, because Americans are the largest untapped market on earth for this product, and the firms know it. Demand can be manufactured. A 1,000% increase in applications to a firm that has just spent 5 years building an American sales operation is not, on its own, evidence of anything except a successful American sales operation. I want to sit in this for a moment, because this is the point where I nearly abandoned the entire project. Take all of it together. The forecasters are demonstrably bad at forecasting. The base rate is unmeasured. The historical cases are selected. The primary data source sells the service it measures. The stated motivations are ordinary. The false positives are numerous, and the true positives are famous only because they were true. By any reasonable epistemic standard, the correct conclusion is that elite hedging tells you nothing about the future. And it took me a long time to understand why that conclusion, which I believe is correct, does not make me feel any better at all. Because there is one thing that survives every single one of those objections, and I did not see it until I stopped asking whether the hedgers were right. Look at the failures again. 2008. Brexit, the pandemic. In each case, the elite failed to predict an event. Fine, now ask a different question. In each case, what happened to them afterwards? The institutions that generated the 2008 crisis were recapitalized with public money. The individuals who ran them retained their fortunes almost without exception. The asset holders whose portfolios collapsed in March of 2020 saw those portfolios recover to record highs within 18 months on the back of the largest monetary intervention in history. While the people whose income came from labour rather than assets absorbed the losses permanently. They were wrong. And it did not cost them anything. That is a very strange property for a signal to have, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because it means the entire question I have been asking for the last hour was the wrong question. I have been asking whether elites can predict collapse. The question I should have been asking is what happens to a society when its elites no longer need to be right. In 1970, an economist named Albert Hirschman published a short book with an unglamorous title that has quietly become one of the most useful pieces of thinking anyone has ever done about institutions. It is called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and it started with a question about Nigerian railways. Hirschman had noticed something counterintuitive while working in West Africa. The state railway was deteriorating, freight customers were abandoning it for road haulage. And conventional economics said this was fine, because competition disciplines a failing provider and the loss of customers would force the railway to improve. It did not improve, it got worse, and Hirschman worked out why, and the answer is the load-bearing idea of this entire video. When an organisation begins to decline, the people who depend on it have two ways to respond. They can complain, organise, vote, sue, lobby, turn up to the meeting, and make a nuisance of themselves. Hirschman called this voice. Or they can simply leave, take their custom, their capital, their children and their attention somewhere else. He called this exit. The critical insight is that these two mechanisms are in competition with each other, and exit destroys voice. The customers most capable of exercising effective voice are always the same customers most capable of exit. They are the ones with resources, alternatives, connections and leverage. They are the ones whose complaints would actually be listened to. And when exit is available and cheap, those are precisely the customers who leave first, because leaving is easier than fighting and they can afford it. What remains behind is the population that could not leave. They are the ones who most need the organisation to improve, and they are the ones with the least capacity to make it improve. Because the people who had that capacity took it with them out the door. The Nigerian railway got worse because the customers who could have forced it to get better had cars. Now hold that mechanism against everything in this video. A senatorial family in the 4th century acquires the right to remit its taxes directly to the imperial treasury, bypassing the municipal system. That is exit, not from the empire, from the local institution. And it happens to be the exit of precisely the household whose participation was keeping the municipal system solvent, and whose complaint, had it complained, would have been the only complaint the provincial governor had to listen to. The city then decays, not because the family left the city, but because the family stopped being affected by whether the city worked. The Assembly of Notables in 1787 refuses a universal land tax. That is exit. They are physically present, they are politically dominant, they are the only body capable of authorising a reform that would save the monarchy, and they use that capacity to remove themselves from the fiscal system instead of to repair it. Voice was available to them. It was in fact uniquely available to them. They used exit. 5 men at a round table ask a media theorist how to control armed guards after the collapse of money. That is exit. Not one of them asks how to prevent the event. Not one of them asks what could be funded, lobbied for, or built. Every question is about surviving the failure. None is about averting it. And these are men with the resources to fund an averting on a scale that no ordinary citizen could contemplate. And the American professional and business class, buying second citizenships at a rate that has increased by over 1,000% in 6 years, while domestic political participation curdles and institutional trust reaches historic lows, is exit. Legal, sensible, individually rational exit. Hirschman's finding is that the availability of exit is not neutral. It changes the behaviour of the people who have it in advance of them using it. The moment a viable exit exists, the calculation shifts, and the effort that would have gone into repair goes into preparation instead. And the shift is invisible from the outside, because the person has not left. They are still at the meeting, they are still voting, they are still saying and meaning that they believe in the institution. Rutilius Namatianus wrote the most beautiful surviving hymn to the eternity of Rome while on a boat going the other way, and I told you at the time that I did not think he perceived any contradiction, and I want to be clear now that I do not think he was a hypocrite. I think he is the most honest witness in this entire story. He believed every word. He was also leaving. Both facts were true simultaneously, and the second one was the one that mattered. Now let me give you the one piece of quantitative evidence that survives all of my objections, because there is one, and it is narrower than I would like, and it is real. The economics literature on financial crises has spent 40 years looking for early warning indicators, and the International Monetary Fund maintains an entire apparatus for this. Out of everything that has been tested, capital flight is one of the few variables that repeatedly demonstrates genuine predictive power. The sudden stop literature, the currency crisis literature, the capital flow reversal work, all of it converges on the finding that when domestic capital begins leaving a country at scale, a currency or banking crisis follows with a measurable lag with better than chance frequency. That is a real result, and it is the strongest empirical support this entire subject has. It is also much smaller than it sounds, and I need you to see exactly how small, because this is where almost every popular treatment of this material cheats. Capital flight predicts financial crises. It does not predict civilizational collapse. Those are not the same phenomenon at different magnitudes. A currency crisis is an event inside a functioning system. Argentina has had many. The state persists, the courts sit, the children go to school, and in a decade there is another one. Nothing in the early warning literature licenses any inference about the failure of a state. And anyone who takes the sudden stop research and stretches it over the fall of Rome is committing a category error large enough to drive a legion through. The honest position after everything is this. There is decent evidence that elite capital movement predicts financial dislocation on a horizon of a few years. There is essentially no evidence that anybody, elite or otherwise, can predict institutional collapse. The forecasting claim, the thing that makes your stomach drop, does not survive contact with the data. And yet, every single one of the 4 historical cases in this video shares a feature that has nothing to do with forecasting, and I did not notice it until I had written all 4 of them out and read them next to each other. In none of them did the elite hedge and then the system fail. In all of them, the hedging was itself a component of the failure. The Roman aristocracy did not exit a broken fiscal system, their exemptions broke it. The Assembly of Notables did not flee a doomed monarchy, their refusal doomed it. The withdrawal of elite funding from Roman cities did not follow urban decline. It produced urban decline, and the archaeology reads exactly the same either way, which is why it took so long for anyone to see it. The hedge is not a forecast, the hedge is a withdrawal of the stake, and a society is not a set of institutions. A society is a bet that a large number of powerful people have placed on a shared outcome, and the institutions are what that bet looks like when it is written down. Courts function because the people who could corrupt them need them to be credible. Currencies hold because the people who could abandon them are holding them. Cities are maintained because the people who could afford to leave have decided to stay. Every one of those is a hostage arrangement. The system works because the people with the power to break it have their own necks inside it. And what I have spent 2 hours showing you is not a group of people predicting the collapse of that arrangement. It is the arrangement being dismantled, quietly, one family at a time, by the only people with the standing to dismantle it. Joseph Tainter, an anthropologist who wrote what remains the best single book on this subject in 1988, arrived at the same place from a completely different direction, and I do not think he and Hirschman ever discussed it. Tainter's argument in The Collapse of Complex Societies is that complexity is a problem-solving strategy with a cost curve. A society encounters a difficulty and responds by adding complexity, more administration, more specialization, more infrastructure, more law. Early on this works extremely well, and the returns are enormous. Over time the easy problems get solved, and each additional increment of complexity costs more and delivers less. Eventually the marginal return on complexity goes negative, and the society is paying an ever-increasing overhead for a system that solves fewer of its problems every year. The part everybody quotes is that this leads to collapse. The part almost nobody quotes is Tainter's account of how it actually happens, and in his telling it does not arrive as a catastrophe at all. It arrives as a decision. Collapse, in Tainter's model, occurs when significant portions of a population conclude that the benefits of participation no longer justify its costs, and opt out. He is explicit that this is frequently a rational, even attractive choice for the people making it. Peasants in the late Roman West sometimes preferred the arrival of the barbarians, because taxation under the new arrangement was lighter. Collapse is what a complex society looks like from the outside, when enough people inside it have individually decided that the overhead is no longer worth paying. Now put that next to Mancure Olson, who came at it from economics in 1982. Olson's argument in The Rise and Decline of Nations is that stable societies accumulate distributional coalitions over time. Interest groups, professions, industries, associations, all of which discover that it is far more efficient to secure a larger share of the existing pie than to make the pie larger. These coalitions are difficult to form and almost impossible to dislodge. They accumulate steadily during periods of stability, and past a certain density they strangle the society's capacity to adapt to anything. Olson's dark implication, which he stated plainly and which nobody has ever much liked, is that the mechanism has no internal cure. Coalitions do not voluntarily dissolve. Historically, they have been cleared by catastrophe. Defeat in war, occupation, revolution. He points at post-war Germany and Japan, which had their coalition structures destroyed by total defeat and then grew faster than the victors. And then Pareto, a century earlier, describing what he called the circulation of elites. Every governing class, he argued, must continually absorb capable people from below and shed incompetent people from above. Or it ossifies. When circulation is blocked, when the talented cannot rise and the useless cannot fall, the pressure does not dissipate. It accumulates until the replacement happens all at once, violently, from outside the system. 3 thinkers, 3 disciplines, 3 centuries between the events they were describing, and one shared conclusion. The mechanism that destroys a society rarely arrives from outside it. What does the damage is the withdrawal of participation by the people who benefit most from it at the exact moment their participation is most needed. Which brings us to why the current configuration is the specific one that concerns me, and I want to lay it out as coldly as I can. Turchin's elite overproduction gives you a surplus of educated, resourced, ambitious people competing for a fixed number of elite positions, which historically produces intra-elite conflict, which historically produces political violence, because thwarted elites are the only class capable of organising anything at scale. But every historical case of elite overproduction Turchin studies occurred under a constraint that no longer applies. The losers could not leave. A thwarted French provincial noble in 1785 had nowhere to go. A frustrated Roman curial had nowhere to go. A blocked Ming scholar official had nowhere to go. Their only available strategy was to fight for position inside the system, which is destructive and violent and terrible, and which is also, and this is the part that matters, a form of engagement. The men who made the French Revolution were thwarted elites. They were also, in the most literal sense, reformers. They stayed, and they fought, and what came out the other side was a state with a functioning tax system, and a legal code that most of Europe eventually copied. That is what voice looks like when exit is unavailable. It is ugly, and it is expensive, and it works. What we have now, for the first time in the history of the phenomenon, is elite overproduction with a functioning exit market. Cheap air travel, portable capital, digital assets, a competitive international market in citizenship, and a class of professionals whose entire business is arranging departure. The thwarted elite of the 21st century does not have to fight for a position inside a deteriorating system. It can buy a Grenadian passport for $235,000 and be somewhere else. And the size of that difference is difficult to overstate. It separates a society that convulses and reforms from a society that quietly empties of everyone capable of reforming it. I keep coming back to what those 5 men in that room did not ask. They had, between them, the resources to fund political campaigns, buy media, endow institutions, finance research, lobby legislatures. Everything on the table was about the security of the compound. Not one question about the possibility of the thing not happening. They had already exited. They were simply still physically present, the way Rutilius was still writing about the eternity of Rome from the deck of a departing ship. And you need to be clear about where you are standing in this, because I am not going to pretend this is a story about someone else. The hedge is not available to you. I do not mean that as a rhetorical flourish. I mean it arithmetically. The entry price for the cheapest meaningful version of it is 200,000 United States dollars, and that buys you the passport of a small Caribbean state, not the compound and not the trust and not the gold. The serious version costs millions. The mechanism I have spent 2 hours describing is accessible to something on the order of 0.1% of the population of a rich country, and to essentially nobody anywhere else, which means the population that would bear the full cost of an institutional failure is the same population that has no capacity whatsoever to hedge against one, and is also the population that has been asked, continuously and with increasing insistence, to have faith in institutions whose most sophisticated participants are quietly buying insurance against them. You are not in the room with the round table. You are the security force. There is a final property of this that I have been circling for 2 hours, and I want to state it directly, because it is the thing that turns a pattern into a trap. The behaviour accelerates itself. Every family that converts its position from participation to preparation raises the cost of staying for everyone still participating. The tax base narrows, so the rate on the remaining base rises. The political constituency for maintaining institutions thins, so maintenance gets deferred. The people whose complaints carried weight are no longer complaining, because they are no longer affected, and each of those effects makes the case for leaving stronger for the next family down, who are watching the family above them go and drawing the obvious conclusion. There is a name for a market where everyone rationally does the thing that makes the thing more necessary. It is a run. And a run does not require anybody to be right about the underlying asset. A bank with a perfectly sound loan book fails if enough depositors withdraw, and every individual depositor who withdraws is behaving sensibly, and the collective outcome is a catastrophe that nobody chose and nobody predicted and everybody caused. That is what I think we are looking at, not a group of well-informed people reading a decline. A run on institutional participation, conducted in slow motion over decades, by individuals each of whom is making an entirely defensible decision about their own family, which is why the closing of the exit window is not the reassurance it appears to be. Watch what states do when they notice this happening. The European Court of Justice terminates Malta's programme. Portugal deletes its property route. Greece triples its threshold. The Weimar government introduces a flight tax in the depths of a depression to stop capital hemorrhaging out. The National Convention declares meagre property forfeit. Honorius, notably, went the other way and helped, which tells you something about how far gone the Western Empire already was in 408. Every one of those measures is defensible. Several are admirable. A state has a legitimate interest in preventing its wealthiest citizens from stripping their capital out during an emergency, and any government that failed to act would be failing in its duty. But look at what the existence of the measure actually announces. A state does not build a wall to keep capital in until it has concluded that its capital wants out. The exit control neither causes the crisis nor cures it. What it marks is the moment the state stops pretending it does not know and begins acting on information its own elite has been acting on for years. And here is the horrible geometry of it. The exit controls always arrive too late to catch the people they are aimed at, because the people they are aimed at are the ones who moved early, when moving looked paranoid. What the controls catch is the second wave, the merely comfortable, the professionals, the small business owners, the families who were not sure and waited to be sure, who are trapped by a measure designed for people who left 3 years ago. In Germany, that is not an abstraction. The flight tax was introduced by a democratic republic in 1931 for sound fiscal reasons, and the people it eventually destroyed were not the ones it was written for. I said earlier that the honest answer to whether the elites are right does not survive contact with the data, and I meant it, and I want to close by telling you what I think the answer actually is. Because the title of this video makes a promise, and I am not going to weasel out of it. Historically, mass elite hedging means one thing. It does not mean that collapse is coming. There is no evidence for that claim, and I have spent a substantial portion of this video demolishing it. What it means is that the people with the greatest capacity to repair a society have stopped experiencing its failure as their own problem. There is no prediction anywhere in that statement. It is a measurement of the present, and what it measures is the removal, in real time, of the specific force that has historically prevented deterioration from becoming collapse, which is the self-interest of people who cannot afford for things to break. And once that force is removed, you do not need anybody to be right about anything. The system does not fail because they foresaw it. It fails because they stopped holding it up. And they stopped holding it up because they no longer had to. And they no longer had to because somewhere in the last 40 years it became possible to be enormously rich in a country without being dependent on that country. Which is a genuinely new thing under the sun, and which almost nobody has thought about carefully. Melania the Younger freed around 8,000 slaves in the course of her liquidation, and the church has celebrated that act for 1,600 years, and it deserves to be celebrated. But I have been thinking about those 8,000 people for weeks now. They were freed into 5th century Italy, into a landscape 2 years from the sack of Rome, in an economy about to lose its long-distance trade, its coinage quality, its pottery, its literacy and its security, in a province whose cities had stopped being repaired because the people who repaired them had already gone. They received their liberty at the precise moment that liberty stopped being worth very much, from a family that was converting its position into gold and getting on a boat. Nobody wrote down what happened to them. The record did not lose that information by accident. Preserving the family and losing the 8,000 is what the record was built to do. The record preserves the departure of the family and loses the fate of the 8,000, and every historical case in this video has the same shape, because history is written from the archives of the people who successfully relocated their archives. George Vine stood at a window in Shanghai and watched a line of men carry the reserves of a nation down to a boat, and he had no idea what he was looking at. That is the normal condition. The gap between the public position and the private position is never concealed. There is simply never an announcement. It gets carried out of a side entrance at 3 a.m. by porters with poles across their shoulders, in plain view of anyone who happens to be awake, and it does not become legible until decades later when a historian pulls the telegrams. The telegrams for this one are already written. They are called quarterly migration reports, and central bank reserve statistics, and trust company filings, and planning applications for a property on the north shore of Kauai with an escape hatch in the basement. Nothing is hidden. Every number in this video came from a document that you can read this afternoon. The window does not close when the danger arrives. It closes when the danger becomes obvious to ordinary people, which is years after the people who were leaving have already left, and it is closed by a legitimate government acting in good faith in a real emergency for reasons that will sound completely correct at the time. You will know it as shut because it will be reported as a reform, and the people who own the country you live in will not be in it.